So today we have Dr. Drew Altschul, who is a British Academy postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Psychology at the University of Edinburgh. And he's going to talk to us today about big team science. So I will pass over to you, Drew, if you can share your screen.
Great. Yeah. Thanks, Caitlin.
Perfect.
Wait, nope, wrong window. Can you see that, or did I choose the wrong one? I can't hear you.
On your email window.
Yeah, it's my email. All right. Let's try again. There we go. How's that?
Perfect.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, so I'm Drew. I'm going to talk a little bit about big team science, which is, I guess, a movement that I've been involved in for a little while. It's a pretty young movement in the scheme of things, but so I've been involved in what's called the ManyPrimates group, which I'll talk about a little bit later on. But as big team science has kind of grown and expanded over the last basically 10 years, not much more than that, we've grown quite a bit of community. And even develop some like meta-scientific efforts to understand big team science, which I'll touch along the way. But for now, yeah, let's jump in. So just what exactly is big team science? So the definition from a paper by Patrick Forcher, who's involved in the Psychoscience Accelerator, he defines it as big team science is a method involving relatively large number of collaborators who may be dispersed across labs, institutions, disciplines, cultures, and continents. And they contrast this system with small team science, which is usually organized around single PIs and their trainees, which is the typical system that we get in most labs and groups across the universities. If the unique risks and challenges of big team science are properly understood and managed, this method of collaboration may have great potential to improve the efficiency and information value of psychological science. So that's a good promise. That's a good place to start. But I'd like to provide a little bit of a simpler definition of my own. Basically, big team science is when a bunch of researchers get together to address research questions that we couldn't reasonably be able to answer on our own. So this means it often has to do with questions of sample size and generalizability, at least to start out. Often they come from the areas of, I'm trying to answer questions about replication. Will a particular finding replicate? Will a particular finding replicate in such a way that can be generalized across larger number of samples, different cultures, different countries, that kind of thing. And so often, and originally even, these efforts were all about replicating existing critical core findings, things that people were taking for granted in some cases. But as things at times have gone on, there's been plenty of scope for extension of existing findings. A lot of our studies will start with something we want to replicate, and then we'll do two things. We'll maybe innovate on the methods and try and come up with the best tests possible for conceptual replication of that particular finding, and then extend further and see, okay, if this, depending on what we find out after pre-registering, we might then try and extend and see what the limits are and learn something more about a particular finding. And I've already touched on these terms a little bit already, but it can't be emphasized enough how much big team science relies on open science practices all across the board, because we need them to be able to function. Like, in order for people to be able to agree in such large groups on what we're going to do, we need to have a process for deciding, and that fits perfectly with pre-registration registered reports. In order for people to contribute on code and materials and stuff like that, we need to use some kind of open, accessible repository, which is why most people use places like GitHub. So if you're not so familiar with like what all the different types of big team science groups are, there's some key examples I can describe. So there's the Psychoscience Accelerator, also known as the PSA. That's kind of like the central sort of big scale human, adult human, cross-cultural, social psychology, somewhat cognitive psychology big team science group. They're probably the largest at this point. And then there's ManyBabies, which is sort of the same except for developmental psychology. And there are some groups like FORT and CREP. Those are the Framework for Open and Reproducible Research Training. And CREP is a collaborative replication education projects. And so they focus, they're big team groups, but they actually focus a little bit more on education. So like FORT focuses on how to do big team science, how to apply big team science and do it a little bit with like postgraduates, and CREP is more about undergraduates. And then things like research contests, those fit in as well. If you've ever heard of like a mini analyst project, that would be a big team science group as well. There's ManyPrimates, which I'm part of, and there's many other animal-based many groups, and there's now even a Many-Minis, which is all of the animals groups trying to work together. And then there's some more like faces, miles, languages, classrooms. You can have any number of many somethings, but they're not all named that way. And some of these aren't even ongoing projects. Many of them are, but like Many Smiles, for instance, was ad hoc. They did one big, they got a bunch of people together, we just did one big project. And then there wasn't even a plan for continuity of that project. So then a bit of history just to kind of give some sort of grounding for like why this happened, where it all came from. I guess we could start at the beginning of this millennium. Let's say that after 2000, replicability and reproducibility gradually started to get more discussed. And then things really started to hit the fan after around 2010, when various big findings started to not replicate, and people like Yuri Simonson and others started writing about false positive psychology and things like that. And then a few years later, the first mini labs study was published. That was in 2014. And that came out in Social Psychology, and you might even recognize some of the names on this paper. And so this is relatively small in the scheme of things, but this was the first big scale replication study of existing findings. And that's what Many Labs was, what it started out being. And again, that was in 2014. And actually, the big estimating reproducibility of psychological science paper that was in Science, that only came out in 2015. And that kind of followed from Many Labs. And there were a few other Many Labs branded projects that were carried out after that. But eventually, the whole effort and community transitioned to what we're now calling the PSA. But also since 2014, there have been other groups like Many Babies, and together PSA and Many Babies are very productive. They've been steadily executing research projects. And then there's others like ManyPrimates I'm part of that have come up about a bit more recently. And there's also a number of dedicated conferences that we have for this now. And our members will often represent individual projects or even the movement more generally at wider conferences and seminars. And we've also been publishing some more general pieces. Perhaps the most notable one is this one, which was managed to make it as a comment piece in Nature, basically trying to make people aware of what big team science is, why it's great, what the challenges are. But there's much more. There's also like this paper in RSOS about how you actually make a big team science project work, how you build it up, and so on. And then again, since I'm from the comparative side of things, we recently published a more specific paper about how to make this work. And what the benefits are for the comparative cognition. And then, of course, there's some more critical pieces. This is the Patrick Forscher et al. Paper where the definition I introduced comes from, and they're a bit more focused on how to critically improve the movement as well. And we've written a similar paper that we're working on at the moment, again for comparative cognition side of things, to look at what the challenges are and how we can be critical and improve the movement. So that's sort of where we are at the moment. But I also want to talk a little bit about how these kinds of projects actually work from the inside. So I'm going to talk about ManyPrimates because that's my personal example. A little bit more detail about us. We have about 200 researchers who work with about 60 species, 60 plus species, depending on the project. And that comes to hundreds of animals, which is a lot. Hundreds is a lot of animals for a comparative psychology project. And there's about 50 institutions and about 30 countries involved, but we don't really have firm records on this because we're here to with the ideas of radical openness. So anyone can join, anyone can participate, and we don't really keep track of a membership. In terms of infrastructure, what we have now, we rely heavily on email lists. We have several ongoing email threads that we rely on. We have a Slack. We use Google Drive, and we use GitHub, and we use OSF for pre-registrations and things like that. So the existing open science infrastructure and general other open source software and tools have been serving us quite well. How do we operate? So we basically we choose research projects in a democratic manner. We have a process whereby we generate ideas, we come together, we shortlist ideas, people write proposals, and then every stage people are voting, and then finally the whole membership decides, okay, which of the currently proposed projects are we going to go forward with? And so far we've carried out a full short-term memory project. We're in the finishing, putting the finishing touches on a project studying inhibitory behavior in primates. We're currently about to launch data collection for an inference by exclusion project. And also now in the background, we're managing a data linkage meta project for trying to bring these data together with administrative data and demographic data across projects. And then we're also developing a wild versus captive comparison project for wild versus captive primates. So let me just get into a little bit about that short-term memory project, because that's the one that's actually complete. So what this is, in primates, in primate studies, primate cognitive studies, when we talk about short-term memory, we're talking really simple. So this task, the basic idea was, we're going to take a task that people have used across a lot of different settings, a lot of different species, and it's just a cup game. But there's no moving of the cups. There's no switching around. This is just, we're going to hide a treat under the cup, one of these cups, and then we're going to make the monkey wait. And it's going to be 15-second wait or a 30-second wait, depending on the condition, or there'll be immediate trial. There'll be no delay trials as well. And the idea is just, okay, how well does a monkey remember where a treat is after 15 or 30 seconds? And so I can show you some examples. You can see here, there's a lot of different types of setup, but the cups are always the same. So here's one example. I believe this is a Langer. He's just getting introduced to the task. These two videos are both from pilot data. And he gets it. He knows where it is. So just describe the condition a little bit more and how we set this up. Like these videos, they would send us these videos. Every site would send us their setup, and the coordination group for this project, which I was a member of, would basically would review all the videos and say, okay, this looks fine, or okay, can you change this little thing here? Okay, so let's look at another setup. So this is with some lemurs at the Duke Lemur Center, I believe. Again, so the cup arrangement is the same. The boards can be different. The cup type can be different. But there's a central paradigm that we're trying to rely on here. I was really quite surprised when this lemur got this correct, because it really didn't seem like he was paying attention. But they don't do as well as you might think. This is not a super easy task for them, and I'll show you some results in a little bit. There's really quite a bit of interspecies and individual differentiation and performance that we were able to get at. Let's go to the next slide. Nope. There we go. So in terms of like the developmental process for how we come up with these ideas and how we implement them, as I sort of touched on this before, we will choose a topic. Once we've decided what a topic is, once the membership is chosen, okay, we're going to do this. We're going to focus on this topic. Then we get a task force of volunteers from the membership group. They will explore the literature, they'll develop a paradigm, and they'll eventually pre-register data collection with input from the whole membership as well. Once the paradigm is pre-registered, we'll put out a call for sites to collect data, maybe for a year, maybe for longer. During COVID, we'd had quite a few extensions in our data collection. The coordination team will then also liaise with all the sites, make sure the setup and data is produced, like in the data sheets, are okay and something we can work with. And the window will close after a specified period, and then the pre-registered analysis will be carried out, usually with some variations, which we also document. And then once we have the analyses, we collaboratively write the paper. And so the final product of this for the short-term memory paper was this big paper. I couldn't even show all the names. And this is probably the largest ever paper of primate cognition that's ever been produced. And this is sort of our key finding, because there's so many individuals here, it's sort of hard to see what's going on. But in these studies, the lines for, so there was a short delay, i.e. no delay, medium delay, and then a long delay. Medium was 15 seconds, long was 30 seconds. And so we can see the average performance. So they're clearly better when they don't have to wait. But the performance does start to get down towards 0.5, which is chance performance. No, sorry, chance performance is 0.33. So they're above chance, generally speaking, but there's also quite a few, you can see quite a few black dots with constant intervals that are really just sitting around 0.3. So there's quite a few species even that aren't even managing to do this. But then I'll draw your attention to the grade 8 clade, which is now highlighted, and they do quite a bit better. There's a bit of an exception with certain orangutans, but in general, phylogenetically speaking, in the phylogenetic analysis, we can see the great apes do better at this than the other primates. So there's still plenty for us to do, both in ManyPrimates and in bee team science more generally. Like the movement, quite young at this point. It's only been going on for at most 10 years if you want to go all the way back to many labs. But even the PSA has been around only for 7 years. We've been around for 5 years. And so there's a lot of things to work on. For us, maintaining a momentum and interest in the projects is a constant thing we need to keep in mind and work on. Growing the diversity is also super important, particularly for like ManyPrimates. Like most of our species live in countries in the global south. So it's important for us to, in order to engage with those species, we should engage with the people who actually live with them, live among them, who are from the same parts of the world. So that's a really important thing for us. And for cross-cultural studies, like in many babies in the PSA, it's also very important for their generalizability. Keeping the project sustainable, that's all about how we can keep things going, how we can manage to both keep the momentum going, but also have an infrastructure that can sustain itself so that we don't, we can be efficient and keep focusing on the research. And that also ties into funding. A few groups have gotten funding for this, but still typically most of the funding comes for individual research projects or individual research thrusts. So the PSA got a big grant from the Templeton Foundation, but it wasn't for infrastructure. It wasn't for the PSA generally. It was for the PSA to answer some specific questions that the Templeton Foundation was interested in. And as of yet, there's been no funding for infrastructure. There are been some attempts and some good possibilities to get infrastructure and network funding grants out there, which are quite new in the ecosystem. But so far, we haven't gotten any yet. And just to tap a little bit on generalizability and diversity, this is something that Ade and Patrick and others have highlighted in BTS as well. Like it's quite important if we really want to understand the breadth of not just human, but even just cross-species, cross-cultural psychology and behavior. It's important for us to think really critically about these things. And we're trying to do this again in the comparative cognition side of things too. This paper isn't out yet, but I'm going to draw on it for some talking points for us to discuss. I'm going to draw on both those papers. So I'll just give a quick rundown of these. So these are some of the challenges and the risks that we're facing as a movement. First of which, making the culture and facies fair empirical comparisons. That's really an experimental thing. That's about how do we make comparisons the fair between different groups, different species. I'm used to thinking about the species. This is a cultural issue as well, but I'm used to thinking about species because I study animals. And so it's like, how do you give a task to a fish that is the same difficulty and the same, but also represents the same cognitive capacities that you give to a primate? That's something that we're facing right now with the larger consortiums. And then there's just an issue of site differences. Sometimes we assume we just take site differences to introduce noise, and that's kind of a basic approach we can take, and that's something that having a big sample and lots of different sites allow us to do sometimes. But nevertheless, there are these important site differences that we could be tapping into and learning something from, and maybe improving our research by doing that. There's a lack of incentives. I sort of touched on that before. This isn't a very well-funded area. Like collaborative research isn't something that will get you necessarily a promotion. It depends on where you are, but like at the University of Edinburgh, there's a specific set of documents that you're supposed to read if you're doing promotion cases. And it's basically an added bit of advice, I don't know, 10 pages or so, where if someone has a deeply collaborative or is involved in large group work, you're supposed to read this advice and consider those extra things before you assess someone for promotion, which is a big ask. And I don't think that a lot of people necessarily are going to so easily be able to take that kind of information on. So it's a challenge. It's a challenge both from within the system and outside from like funders and even journals. In terms of infrastructure, I touched on that as well. Building infrastructure is not easy. It's quite difficult. It takes time. It takes resources. Maintaining it is something that has to happen. It's not something we can take for granted. It also requires kind of maintenance resources, maintenance funding as well. And it's not something that we've been able to get yet. Waiting for institutions to catch up. I've kind of touched on this a little bit as well. That's like journals. That's universities. That's funders as well. These projects produce more reliable, robust, more generalizable research and outputs than most studies, than the average study. But at this point, they don't really get any particular recommendation beyond what you'd get out of just a single paper. A paper is still a paper. There's no particular value given to the big team science papers. Leadership within these groups, I mean, that's just always an issue. We're scientists. We're not admin. We're not experts in leadership. We're not people who have come out who've been hired from the corporate world to be as CEOs or anything like that. We're just researchers who want to do the best research we can, and there's always issues to do with accountability. Not necessarily problems, but like this is a challenge for us too. And like one of the meta science projects I've been working on recently is thinking about how leadership in big team science works, how to maintain accountability, how to improve management or maintain good management within this unique group of people. And then there's conservatism, which I think is quite an interesting one. And I hadn't really thought about that until I read that paper by Forscher et al., which is that was about the idea that large groups, and these are big team science groups, so assumingly they're pretty large groups tend to be a bit slower moving and a bit more kind of conservative in their goals and aims. And we make we kind of compensate for that a little bit by being radically open and very forward about the open science that we do and trying to be progressive in the future. But nevertheless, there is this, I think, gravity to having a large group and trying to appease a lot of people and to get everyone to agree that creates a more conservative atmosphere. And that's worth considering and worth thinking about how how that affects the kind of science we make. So I'll stop for now, and we can just have a chat.